Hello, and welcome to our last day of our 5-day webinar series called Life Made Accessible, Accessing the Future, in honor of National Accessibility Week, which takes place from May 31st to June 6th. Our event is an opportunity to see into the lives being presented to you. We hope it will give better understanding of the paths that some individuals with disabilities need to take. With understanding, we hope it will lead to a world more accessible. My name is Sherry Roberts, and I work for the Independent Living Center as a Community Resource Coordinator. And today I am your host. Today's webinar, we will look at new technologies that are breaking barriers. But before we begin, just a couple of notes. The spirit of this event is an opportunity for learning. Our panelists will be sharing personal experiences and perspectives. This is their story. They do not speak on behalf of all individuals living with a disability. We encourage you to comment and ask questions to our panelists throughout the webinar using the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. The last 10 to 15 minutes of our time together will be dedicated to answering some of your questions. Please remember to be appropriate and courteous. We are pleased to provide both CART transcription and interpretation services for today's webinar. To enable closed captioning, click on the closed caption button on the bottom of your Zoom window, and then choose subtitles. Just a reminder to please speak slowly and clearly so that our interpreters can capture all of your messages. To begin, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Andrina Lockley-Brown. Andrina is the program manager for the Independent Living Center of Waterloo Region. For over 20 years, Andrina has been working hard to help remove barriers for people with disabilities in her community. Her passion is program development, creating opportunities for people to connect with one another and their community, and to learn new skills. When not working, Andrina enjoys time with her husband, children, and her new puppy, Benny. Over to you, Andrina.
Thanks, Sherry. I am pleased to moderate the final webinar in our week-long Life Made Accessible series. As you may know, disability rates in Canada and around the world are on the rise. Also on the rise is accessibility awareness and new and exciting technology that helps to remove barriers for people. So it seems fitting that we would wrap up this week with a look at the relationship between people with disabilities and technology, and a look at cutting edge technologies that are truly changing lives. Now to meet our speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Diane Underschultz. Diane is a Community Relations Assistant Manager with the Canadian Administrator of VRS, Video Relay Service, an internet-based telecommunication service offering deaf, hard of hearing, speech impaired, and hearing Canadians a way to communicate between American Sign Language and English, or langue des signes québécois, and French through video interpreters. Diane works with the outreach team. They are responsible for delivering a nationwide program to raise awareness and educate Canadians about VRS. Diane graduated from both Human Resource Management and Sign Language Interpreting. She is passionate about technological advancement, language access, and equal rights. Welcome, Diane. We also welcome...
Hi, thank you very much.
We also welcome Arun Rijwani. Arjun is the program lead for accessible technology and community engagement for CNIB, and also a CNIB client for almost 20 years. The organization has supported him through his education journey and is now an employer. He has always been passionate about technology, and since he's a person with partial sight, accessibility is critical for him. Arjun went to Ryerson University for an information technology and management degree and has worked for consumer electronic companies such as Microsoft, Uber, Square Payments, and others. Arjun was born in India. His family moved to Canada during his early years. Visiting India and other parts of the world has allowed him the opportunity to compare accessibility in different countries. Thanks for joining us today, Arjun.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Dan Lajoie. and Dan is a lifelong advocate for accessibility and inclusion in our community. In his role as the Virtual Program and Community Resource Coordinator with the Independent Living Center of Waterloo Region, Dan helps to connect individuals with disabilities to vital community resources and facilitates peer connections through educational and recreational programs. Dan is also a private accessibility consultant, specializing in corporate accessible website and document remediation. In his spare time, Dan is an active community volunteer and the proud father of 2 children, plus 3 cuddly rats. Great to have you with us, Dan.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So Diane, we'll start with you now. Please tell us about yourself and your work.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be a panelist in this webinar today. I really have been looking forward to sharing my information about VRS. I'll start off first by talking a little bit about my own background. I acquired deafness at 2. My family all have hearing. So I was the only deaf person in my family. I went to school, graduated, and lived through the experience of being deaf in a hearing world, experiencing those communication challenges throughout my life. As technology improved, access improved. And now that VRS is a viable service, access has improved considerably for people who use American Sign Language or LSQ as their language of choice. I have a lot of experience in the area of dealing with hearing people and communication challenges. My first language is American Sign Language. I learned English as a second language. Prior to that, I used to use a message relay service before we had VRS. This was a service that they used, they depended on the use of teletypes. That was not always easily accessible for many reasons. Now that VRS is an option, it's really changed our lives. We have an internet-based service where you can see interpreters on the screen who are acting as operators, if you will, to connect deaf people to hearing agencies, hearing people that they need to speak to over the phone. So this is a much more expedient opportunity for access. It provides with an opportunity for more accuracy within the message. It gives deaf people an opportunity to use their voice in terms of getting what they need and living their lives. With regard to VRS itself, it is a free service to those who use it. There is no cost for those who are deaf and hard of hearing and have an account. They have to download the app. Again, no charge for that app. It is also free. Again, the goal is empowering our community and providing them with access, whether they're deafened, hard of hearing, or have a speech impairment. This provides people with an access to LSQ or ASL. CAV was established in 2016. So it was launched almost 5 years ago. And it was launched due to a lot of deaf community advocacy, a lot of pressure put on the government and on service providers. We fought long and hard through the CRTC until we won that fight and the service was launched. And we've been really thrilled about that ever since, because now communication access is possible and it's easy. This also has an impact on Bill C-81, the accessibility bill that focuses specifically on language, and that is really falling in line. Our service is really falling in line with that act. We have 3 accounts currently that we offer. One is personal, one is business, and another is specifically aimed at youth. The personal accounts can be held by anyone, be they somebody, if I need a job and I need to contact a potential employer, contact my doctor, anything for business purposes would be a business account. A personal account is for my needs in particular. With regard to youth, we're trying to encourage youth, those who are 18 and under, 17 and under, would require a parent signature to have a youth account, but it provides them an opportunity to contact friends, family, all through the use of the VRS service. I think one of the most important access features we provide is the ability to contact 911 immediately. It used to be a very difficult struggle to contact 911 for people who are deaf, deafened, and hard of hearing. With VRS and a telephone, we can contact 911 and connect to their computer system immediately. So people now have access to 911 services right away. If they're hearing people calling in to make a call, let's say they're calling me, but I'm not here, they can leave a video message. Just like you would, as a hearing person, have an answering machine message on your phone. We can leave video messages in American Sign Language or LSQ, and then have the operator interpret that so that you can hear what's being signed. We provide all kinds of information that's available on our website. It's srvcanadavrs.ca if you're interested in looking at all the services we provide.
The website is excellent. I went to check it out. It's lots of good information there. And the tagline, access is opportunity, is perfect because it's absolutely correct. Thanks for that information, Diane. That's very helpful. One thing I noted when you were speaking about ASL being your first language, we didn't do a segment on myth busting here, but they have on a couple of the other webinars. And I think that is one of the myths that we could have listed if we did have time to do that, because I don't think a lot of people know that for some people, ASL is their first language.
That's right, very true.
Thanks. So now over to you, Arjun. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, so thank you once again. My name is Arjun Rijwani, Program Lead for Accessible Technology and Smart Life Projects with CNIB, located in London, Ontario. So I work out of the London Community Hub. Before I tell you a little bit about my role, sort of just to expand on that little intro that was provided earlier. Much like Diane, I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa at a very early age. I was about 6 years old when the doctor had identified the particular type of vision impairment I had. I was also one of the only ones in my family to have this. So there was a lot of unknown, a lot of uncertainty. And it was kind of hard to comprehend, to what extent this vision impairment, what kind of challenges would it bring on in my, just to navigate the schooling systems of India, the accessible side of education, it wasn't as prevalent as Canada has made it, especially in the more recent years. And that was sort of one of the catalysts that my parents had decided to move to Canada, just because they believed that it provided that, the level of attention that I might require. And, now being a member of CNIB for the last 20 years, navigating the schooling system of Canada, went to Humber College, then over to university to earn a degree, right? So definitely it's been quite fruitful for me, as well as my family, to see how far I was able to come in my education. And CNIB has always been there to provide that support, right? So the need of accessibility is very prominent And CNIB has done quite a lot of in the last 20 years to make sure that I'm successful no matter what kind of education path I've picked, right? And I've had a chance to meet with other great personalities who've achieved quite a bit despite having any type of disability, which brings us to this week of having that awareness, right? So CNIB offers a lot of social programs catering to a large variety of subjects, including any kind of challenges that people might face, right? So we really look at it as a sort of a, a community that learns together, that grows together, and most importantly provides that support for those who need it, right? So being a client and now being on the other side of this table and being an employee of CNIB, if I were said that just having the chance to communicate and interact with other like-minded individuals, driven individuals, motivated individuals, it's infectious to be around somebody who always wants to strive to be better tomorrow, right? So now that's one of the great things is to work with CNIB is not only do I get to share that passion, but also relay some of that passion over to somebody who just found out about CNIB and its programs, right? So empowerment is the biggest key that CNIB provides because I notice it in myself. So as a accessible technology lead, that's my job as well to provide the tools really to make sure that people are aware of what's available for them. How can they stretch the technology that they have in their palm at the moment, right? What does their budget allow them to acquire? And as well as, we're at a major point in technological advancement where we see a lot of mainstream devices that are emphasizing their accessibility, right? So not just devices, but the companies that develop the softwares, pretty much the heart and the brain of these devices, they're taking a stronger stance at prioritizing accessibility, which we'll talk more about in later. But yeah, coming back to sort of my role with CNIB is to not only promote social programs and advocate for more accessible technology, but also educate, train, and teach people on how to make the best of the technology that they have in their hands at the moment. As well as CNIB does a lot with their partners. Smartphones, smart devices are the main or the most important component to have on us at all times, right? It's gone from a want, a luxury item to more of a necessity now, especially with the pandemic. Technology has been the best friend, right? So it's more important than ever. And one of my major programs is the Phone It Forward programs, where we work with companies and corporate partners to allow us to accept their donated devices, and we refurbish, repair. Then we actually donated out those devices to our clients at no cost, no strings attached, to make sure that every disabled person in Canada has access to a meaningful device and a mainstream technology. So
that's an awesome service.
yeah, and
Yeah.
more about it in the later coming minutes.
Sounds
So
good.
thank you for having me here.
Our pleasure. Thank you for coming, Arjun. And to Dan, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Why, thank you. Yeah, when I think about technology and the role that it plays in my life, it sort of infiltrates many different aspects of my day-to-day as an individual with a mobility impairment, a physical disability. Obviously, technology plays a huge role in that piece, my mobility, getting around, getting to and fro, getting in and out of bed, and various other tasks. And technology also plays a huge role in my day-to-day work and the things that I do, whether it's on computer or whether it's actually facilitating technology. So it's really interesting for me to think about today and try to think of comments around technology, because it is so intertwined in my daily existence. A little bit about myself. I was born with spinal muscular atrophy. I've always been a wheelchair user. In fact, at the time, many moons ago, I was the youngest person in our region to own an electric wheelchair, a little tiny electric wheelchair. At 3 years old, which was back then horrified most people, thinking of a little 3-year-old driving a mechanical device around. So I've always been a wheelchair user. And you know, I've got some comments later on. We've got some discussion points about sort of the history of our technology. But so starting there, on that level of my life, but then going forward, thinking professionally, and the amount of technology I use day to day in my work. So with the Independent Living Center, I'm a virtual program coordinator. That's one of my jobs. So literally, I use technology as a part of my job to help connect people with disabilities to each other, to their community. So technology plays a huge role there. And even in my other role, my other hat, my side, what do they call it now? Side hustle, if that's the word, my side hustle. I'm a technology specialist. So when we talk about accessible websites and accessible documents, I'm the person who companies consult with to make those things accessible for individuals who, for example, would use a screen reader. So technology sort of lives in my day-to-day, every day, everywhere from moving around my home to the work that I do. So I'm sure I'll have lots to add as we move forward.
Thanks, Dan. Now, you've all, to some degree, pointed out and touched on a little bit of your childhood. So I thought before we dive into the conversation about today's technology or technology in the future, that we'd start with asking you to tell us a little bit about your experience growing up with or without technology. What was that like? Arjun, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think for me, I find myself quite fortunate because I think I've been in a very unique position. I still remember the moment when my dad actually brought, his first computer home, right? We didn't even have any internet connectivity at that moment. We got introduced to dial-up internet. So that was my sort of introduction to the first piece of technology really at home. I had no clue how any of that worked. I had no clue how he connected to internet every day. I just knew if I didn't get my way, or if he didn't do what I was asking for, I could simply just pick up the phone and start bothering him and disconnect his internet connectivity. So and that sort of grew my passion into being fortunate when I was in Canada at high school and college level. Smartphones and cell phones were really coming up. They were getting more and more popular. I've seen a few of my friends get their first phones, kind of really piqued my interest. So I got a job as a sales rep for a couple different cell phone stores. I learned ins and outs of what these devices are, like the Blackberries, right? They were the really introduction into it. Same thing with school. Because of vision impairment, I was always separated from my classmates during exams and tests and brought over to a special room called the test center, right? So I was more given the computers to, instead of writing down and reading a printed copy, I would get a digital format, right? So it I understood early on that digital might be the better option to go for me, because as my life progresses, my vision will deteriorate and digital would be my preferred method of communication, right? And behold, fast forward, I went through college, university, I started getting 100% all of my education in a digital format. Never purchased a book. I looked for websites that I could rent a book instead of buying a printed copy, right? So not only did it help me navigate, the commuting from home to school with less amount of weight in my backpack, I replaced all of those books with a laptop or an iPad, right? So surprisingly, when Apple came out with their iPhones and iPads, they were very early on with accessible tools built into those mainstream devices, right? So that really piqued my interest. And I've been an Apple user for, better half of the decade, if any. And yeah, so I really think mainstream devices definitely are the way to go. But besides just the mainstream devices, making use of JAWS, which is the non-visual software to navigate the computer, as well as Zoom Text, which is the magnifier and screen enhancer for the computer. I've been using it early on, and definitely it's helped me through my education as well as my career development. So those are really critical components for me in order for me to achieve the success that I've set out for myself.
Thanks, Arjun. That's all very interesting. Dan, what about you? Tell us about your experience growing up with technology.
Oh God, I hated computers growing up. You know what? I didn't live in a world of technology growing up. Besides the wheelchair, which, the way I was raised, to me, really didn't exist. I hated computers. I remember going to school, and this would have been in the 80s, to date myself. And they would say, oh, you need to use a computer. You have a disability, you should use a computer. And back in those days, man, I had like Morse code switches that I plugged into the computer, where I would literally Morse code letter by letter on my first computer, which was an Apple IIe, which was an old monochrome, sort of all-in-one unit. And I hated it, and I vowed that I would never be working on computers. I'll never work on computers. I always just wanted to work with people. But as I got older, and became an adult and technology improved, I became to realize that, in fact, a computer was a way for me to be able to actually communicate accessibly, right? To be able to type out, to dictate, as I do now, to meet with people virtually, as I do now. So for me, it's sort of been a love-hate. And I often look back, I think about what I do now. Literally spend 12 hours a day on the computer between work and recreation. And I think about my job. Like, I mean, I was a website designer, and now an accessibility consultant for websites. And this is all technology based. It's all computer based, which is something that I hated and I vowed that I would never do. But as things improved, I guess I agree with the times as well. So it's been really interesting, going from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and the progression of technology and what it's done for people with disabilities is incredible, obviously, and certainly opened up a whole new world.
Well, Dan, I'm glad you changed your mind. Technology. And Diane, what about you? What was your experience like growing up with technology or without?
I think the first technology I can remember being exposed to was closed captions on television. Before that, it was very difficult to watch TV. I'd have to go by action alone to try to figure out what people were doing, what they were saying, because lip reading the actors was far too difficult. I ended up playing more, being more physical, until captions became a reality and I could watch TV a lot more often. I could understand the content, I could understand the dialogue and what was going on. So captions for me were probably the first technology I can remember. Second to that would be the teletype, the TTY keyboard device that you attach to a telephone. You would have to make a phone call to speak to a hearing person, type back and forth to each other, but you both had to have teletype. It was a very long and arduous experience to try to make a phone call with a teletype. And then along came VRS. We set up VRS in Canada following VRS services that were provided in the States some years ago. There was a lot of talk about that service being provided to citizens of the US, and we wanted to have a similar service here. Another technology I'd like to talk about specifically are lighting systems, lighting devices, lights that flash when the phone is ringing, lights that flash when someone's ringing your doorbell. lights that will flash when a baby's crying. We also have lights, specific lights that flash when the smoke detector is going off. All of these are alerting systems, visual alerting systems that were part of technology for me growing up, which also provided better access compared to back in the day when there was no such technology to be had. We would have to rely on family who could hear to indicate to us what was going on in our environment. Now with technology, independence has skyrocketed. That's been a really big help to members of this community. It's key, in fact.
That's a good segue, Diane, because the next question is, what impact has technology had on your life as an adult? Dan, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I want to just quickly reflect on something Arjun had said about schooling and university. And, when I went to university in the 90s, it was still the old school textbook. And I talked to a friend of mine earlier who also uses digital books for reading. And we're both about the same age. And we both said, man, why couldn't this have been around, X number of years ago? How much more accessible schooling would have been if it was digital, not just 30-pound paper textbooks. But as an adult, it infiltrates my every moment, whether it's my mobility device, my wheelchair, or whether it's the work that I do, my environment. I have Google Home and all these clever devices that allow me to do things like turn off and on lights that I've never been physically able to do until now. So it's pretty incredible. What technology can do. And I sometimes feel like part of my enthusiasm for technology and the work that I do is to help make other people's journey a little easier, right? Again, growing up in a time when it wasn't an option to have access to websites, to internet. I didn't have internet until I was in university. And even then it was just dial-in, right? So I think of everyone else now who can benefit from the technology, right? Which is my passion for it. And which is why I, as a consultant, work with companies to sort of enable their technology so that everyone can take advantage of it. So yeah, technology as an adult, it's hard to compartmentalize because it influences every action that I do. Other than, I guess, the words coming out of my mouth would be organic. But other than that, technology plays a huge factor in everything that I do.
Kind of like what Diane was just saying, you being able to turn the lights on and off is I know a level of freedom and independence that you didn't have before. And that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Diane, what about you? You did touch on this a little bit already, but do you want to speak to some of the technology that's had an impact on your life as an adult?
Certainly. My first experience was in the deaf school with deaf students. I would come home not really having any need for interpretation services, but when I went into college, I needed interpretation services. It was really my first experience with it. The challenge for me was a lot of resistance because I didn't even know what the interpreter was for. I didn't realize that that was a purpose to provide access to communication to me and students in the classroom. We also had a note taker. If I had my eyes on the interpreter, I couldn't possibly look down and take notes at the same time. So I'd have to have another service in the classroom with me so that I could adjust and I could thrive, but it took a while to get used to. It was very difficult for me during my college university days because all of my information came to me through an interpreter. These days, there are so many options provided for education online that I could not have anticipated back in the day. Closed captioning is an option that could be provided to students in classroom along with interpretation, which didn't happen back in the day.
And I can imagine, Diane, that the struggle would be, what if your interpreter makes a mistake? What if the information you're getting isn't 100% accurate, or I mean, there's certainly some potential for communication to go wrong in that earlier system.
Well, indeed, it was not an easy job for the interpreter, I can tell you that. Interpretation itself is difficult. These people are human. It takes a lot of preparation, a lot of, in the education system, a lot of discussing concepts with the interpreter, or sorry, with the teacher. Yeah, very, very challenging.
I can imagine.
It was an absolute necessity for having to have a note taker in the class along with an interpreter, because I could not walk away with notes if I was spending the whole day with my eyes on the interpreter.
That makes sense. Arjun, what about you? What role has technology had on your adult life?
It is a critical component for me to communicate, right? So, social media, just communicating with colleagues at work, with friends, even though we have smartphone, a lot of us, the phone functionality is not the key component anymore, right? It's all the other apps, a lot of the text-based apps or video calling apps that you use these devices for, right? So it's really important in that sense, right? So, and on top of that, being a technology lead, a technology trainer, it's not just my job, but it is one of the passions that I have, is to know, what's out there in the market that I can purchase and test and more or less use for my communication purposes, right? So as a result, I have an iPad, an iPhone, but I also have an Android device, right? I have a MacBook and I have a Windows, right? So for somebody with vision impairment, there is no one cookie cutter solution for somebody like a sighted person, right? So we use the tools at our disposal, right, to the best of their capabilities, right? So where iPhones are fantastic for, 6 out of 10 things, you still need to complete the other 4 out of 10 items with other devices that your phone or your device can't help you with, right? So, and technology is really an extension of your personality, right? So, for example, if you have a social media profile, that's your digital self in a way, right? So it is an extension of you as your personality goes, right? The devices you use, they're more or less your limbs in addition to hands and feet, right? Because they ultimately help you communicate and transfer your thoughts to, the people around you, in a sense of influence or a sense of response. So, it is a critical component for me, right? So in any situation, any format I'm in, navigating my world, right? So things like Uber, Lyft, where the area that I live in, transit system is not the best. I have to wait 45 minutes to an hour for the next bus to come by, right? But I find myself in a fortunate position that my time is worth more than me waiting 45 minutes for a transit, where I can pull out my phone, order an Uber, and be on my way within just, a couple minutes of requesting a ride. So things of that nature, I think now it's gone from a luxury want item to being a necessity that, people of disabilities pretty much cannot survive with in a lot of cases, right? And it only enforces us to be more independent. So I think where things go, I don't see myself being apart from any sort of technology device that I'm currently used to or use on a daily basis.
You said something, Arjun, that stuck out to me, and that is the concept of one size not fitting all, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that's sort of the beautiful thing about technology now, as opposed to 20 years ago. It's not here's the solution or here's the device. There's lots of options for people now. So I'm going to skip ahead and talk a little bit about the future. The theme of the webinar is accessing the future. So technology is advancing so quickly right now. As you look to the future, what do you want to have happen, and where do you think technology is going? Arjun, let's just start with you again.
So I think I touched base a little bit about how, we are at a cusp where software definitely takes a stronger stance than what type of hardware we're using, right? So because softwares are sort of the heart and the brain of all our devices, it's really important to think from a ground up sort of design language, right? So things like where I've touched base on, you know, mainstream devices like Apple products, Microsoft softwares, they have accessibility as a priority now. But we're also looking at, how are third-party companies using these devices and the softwares to build custom application, right? Things of with what's happening with computer vision, right? So algorithms that help you do image recognition, you know, we're looking at going from, just an example, something as basic in this context as being, facial detection in your phone's camera application to now companies like Tesla that are relying on computer vision to create an autonomous driving capability, right? So image recognition, the cameras are in the future the eyes of all of our devices, right? Prevalency of cameras are everywhere, from traffic stops to being in our phones to even really compact small sizes, right, where they can help us out. So how are third party companies using these tools and building on top and really merging or blurring the lines between technology that you have on you versus attached to your body so that they're even more so an extension, right? So one of the key components or the key factors that I would use as a takeaway from this context is the friction between a human and the technology, right? So, you have to pull out your phone to look at Facebook, or you have to pull out your phone to make a phone call or send text message. Now you have things like Apple AirPods that have Siri built in. So much like a natural language, you can just say the magic word, send a text, or make a phone call, right? So the friction between human and technology interaction is drastically reducing, and it's just going to be more of a natural interaction, the symbiotic relationship that humans share with technology.
For sure. And it's happening so quickly, and there's so much to unpack there. We could have a whole other webinar topic just on that topic. Dan, what about you? Is there any technology that you see right now that's really exciting, or something that you would like to see in the future?
Well, I'll tell you, it's difficult to follow Arjun's comments. You nailed so many important points that I was going to say. No, I think that when I think about the future of, and I'll remove the sort of professional piece from it, although I do have to say that the dawn of the virtual or the hybrid workplace has certainly been a benefit to myself and some other colleagues of mine who have disabilities. But just thinking of it from a mobility end, I would say that I look forward to, as Arjun said, I guess that the reduction of friction, right? How do we improve the interface, right? How do we make it less about physical interaction with a mechanical device, and how do we incorporate it more into our thought process, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic if I could drive my wheelchair just by thought, right? Just by thinking I want to move there, instead of having to physically move my arm and push a rubber and metal joystick forward. I think that'd be really cool. And, Andrina, we don't have time to unpack all these issues, because the further down that road we get, we start to run into ethical questions, right? At what point do we draw the line? When does it become, do we start talking about genetic alteration? Do we start talking about body augmentation? And what are the ethics around that? So it's a really interesting future that is going to be put upon us. I'm not sure how much we'll see in our lifetime. But I look forward to some small changes along the way that will hopefully allow me to, be independent, right? Be more independent, be independent for longer, right? We think about our aging population and the fact that we're all aging. It's just the way life is. So it would be great if we could sort of introduce technologies that just allow us to express ourselves for as long and as independently as we can.
That's the goal, for sure. Diane, what about you? Is there any technology you'd like to have, you'd like to see created?
Yes, definitely. I guess I might maybe disagree a little in terms of what was just mentioned in terms of technology, because of a lot of that seemed auditory or sound based, and I would like to see an increase in more visual technology, visually based technology that can, broaden the breadth and the depth of the visual based technology. And so that there may be alerting systems, visual lights in vehicles that can alert us to our surroundings auditorily, so that people who are deaf and hard of hearing or people who have an acquired hearing loss have that access as well. So I think that there needs to be both sound and visual based advancements in technology in the future, and that they both need to equally be integrated, so that it's not just one or the other, but they're both readily available and integrated, and so that there's ease of use for everyone and people do not feel the barrier or the frustration. And that's what I hope to see the future of technology.
Thanks, Diane. We're going to turn it over to Sherry now, who has some questions, I believe, from our audience.
I do. Thanks, Andrina. So the first question, emerging technologies provide great benefits and also add to new and existing barriers. As a full-time teacher, the second school system, so the area of special education, I've seen that time is not spent on thoughtfully exploring the new technologies and their evolving updates, such as with Zoom. While policies are in place and guides like policy on accessible education for students with disabilities, technology continues to pose challenges. What, if any, criteria is out there for assessing accessible technology in an effort to educate and prevent barriers?
So I can probably jump on that if no one else wants to first. So I think that the question is pretty accurate, and sometimes the legislation or the supports that follow technology is a little slower, right? So a new device may come out, but if it's not properly promoted or funded through various bodies, then it would certainly be a barrier. I think if we look to the AODA and some of the legislation around accessibility, that's certainly a good first step. However, it's not responsive, right? The AODA came out, Andrina?
2005.
All right. Right. And it does get updated and it does get modified, but it happens at a bit of a snail's pace. So it's difficult to keep up with advancing technologies when the support system behind it takes time to follow through. I mean, so I think that certainly, if not an answer to that question, speaks to its truth.
Okay, next question is, how do I know if my web page or other digital document is accessible? Someone wanna?
I don't want to be a mic hog. You know, I'd love to hear actually from Arjun and Diane on this, because I think it does touch you both, but I can say that in my consulting business, so right now it's still an industry that's in its infancy. And by that, I mean, a lot of companies don't really understand yet what it means to make an accessible website. 5-10 years down the road, I think the technology will be there that websites are just inherently accessible for all users. But right now, there's still a lot of that friction, as Arjun talked about. And that's where I come in, right? So I come in with an understanding of the technology and understanding of the programming, and I help companies to make their websites accessible. But it's challenging because a lot of companies will say their website is accessible and it's not. So I'll often get a referral for a company, and that company will say, oh no, our website was done a few years ago and it's totally accessible. And within about 10 seconds, I can point out several accessibility sort of barriers, right? So it's an industry that's in an infancy. It's growing and it will improve, but you certainly have to watch out. And if you find a website isn't accessible, feel free to send a comment to that company and say, your website is not accessible for me. You know, I use a screen reader or whatever the case may be. And I'd like you to take a look at that.
I wanted to comment on that. If I could just add to answer that question, that is also similar situation for deaf and hard of hearing individual. Many websites are all text-based and there's not ASL translation embedded into the website. So then where is the first language rights access for deaf and hard of hearing individuals who want to access those websites?
That's great. Arjun, I actually personally wanted to say something. You had spoken about Apple being sort of innovative, and Apple is the first company to come up with like a fitness tracker that tracks wheelchair pushes. And so I spent years trying to find like a smartwatch, and finally was able to get one, and they did a lot of work on it. So it's nice to see that some companies are starting to make that a part of the mainstream. So I didn't have to buy a special Apple Watch. I just got the regular one and then was able to tell them I was a wheelchair user, and it tracks me by pushes instead. So I thought that was kind of a cool piece of tech. And yeah, Apple's really ahead of the game, I think, a little bit in that stuff. So
I think like in if I may add to that, like Dan said, it moves at a snail pace, right? If it's not funded appropriately or promoted accurately, it does hinder the chances of, having that product or service accessible, right? So like one of the things that stands out to me is with Apple, their philosophy is to merge technologies with our, humanities, right? So the design aspect of it, right? If you design something eloquently or with, certain passion, right? You have to start with user as the top of the pyramid and then work backwards to how you enable technology and make it so that the user can perform, right? So if you remember, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but when Apple introduced their first computer, they had an engineer who had a blind child, right? And that's where their philosophy from the get-go was to make the devices accessible to everybody, right? And later on, as you notice with iPhones and iPads and generally Apple products, they're one of the few products and companies that you have so many accessories that can tap into their versatile software and take advantage of the IO, right? So with CNIP, we have refreshable braille displays. There are hearing aids that can connect through Bluetooth and, to my experience, convey that information in different formats, right? So they've been really at the forefront of prioritizing accessibility in that sense. But on the second note, I was recently listening to an interview by the CEO of Microsoft, or the current CEO of Microsoft, is that, he has a son with cerebral palsy. So creating technology and creating accessible technology is not just, something that they should look at or it's good for their business model, but the key thing the underlying thing is having empathy, right? So having that level of connectivity and empathy towards your end users really help you enforce creating something that can be used by everybody across the board, right? So in that sense, I think that's something that makes them the market leaders in the segment that they offer their products within, right? So those are some of the key things that I take away from when I look at the back end philosophy of why they create these products and the way they create these products.
Yeah, thanks, Arjun. So that takes us to the end of our webinar. Thank you everyone for your participation today. Many thanks to our organizing committee organizations, the Independent Living Center of Waterloo Region, CNIB Foundation, CHS, Canadian Hearing Services, Community Support Connections, KW Accessibility, Bridges to Belonging, KW Habilitation, and the cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, who contributed towards our closed captioning, video relay service, and transcription services. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists and our moderator for making today's webinar and our whole week of webinars such a great success. In a moment, a very short poll will appear on your screen. If you could just please take a moment to answer a couple of questions about today's event before leaving the webinar, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you and have a fabulous day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.